How you doing, fellow coders, and welcome back to LARTech. In today's video, we will be continuing the Beginner's Python series with episode 3. We will be covering all the different types of variables in Python and what you can do with them. Let's get into the video. So if you haven't already, I recommend you watch the last video in the series. We covered what variables are, and we also covered all the operations you can do on integers. So in the last video, we only did operations on a whole number, which is an integer, and these are all of those operations. But we covered what variables are too, so if you don't know what a variable is, I recommend you watch the last video. So if you've watched the last video, just press Ctrl N to create a new script, and press Ctrl S to save it. And we'll call it types of variables.py. And make sure to save it in your Beginner Python series folder. If you haven't created it already, create it. I'll hit save, and I'll close the other script. So, remember last time we talked about integers. I'll quickly refresh your knowledge on integers. A whole number is just a number that does not have a decimal. For example, an integer could be 4, or 5, or 6, or 7, or 8, or even -1, or -2, or -3. Keeps going. All that matters is that it doesn't have a decimal. If it doesn't have a decimal, it's an integer. So I'm going to go back to my code, and I'm going to make an integer. I'll call it integer example, and I'll set the value to something like 20. Now let's say print integer example, and we get 20. So let's quickly go over some cases where you would need to use an integer. Maybe you're making a game and you need to keep track of what level the player is on. You're never going to have a level that's like 2.5 or 2.3 or something like that, right? It's always going to be a whole number. This is where you would use an integer. So you can make a variable called level, and you can assign it the value of what level the player is on. For example, the player could be on level 1 or level 2 or level 3 or so on. That's a good place to use an integer. You can also use an integer to keep track of how many students are in a class, for example. You're never going to have 1.5 or 1.2 students, right? It's always going to be a whole number. That's where using an integer is ideal. So before we move on to another type of variable, I quickly want to go over the type function. The type function in Python just returns the type of variable. So if we passed in our integer example through the type function, we would get integer. So let's try that. I'm going to say print type integer example. Now notice how we're using two functions here. We're using the print function, and we're using the type function, and returning the type of our variable. Then, after we have the type of our variable, we pass that through the print function, and the print function displays the text to the screen. So I'm going to hit Control Save to save it, and Control B to run it. And we get 20, and then class int. Now the reason we get two different things is because we're printing two different things. The first thing we're printing is the value of integer example, and we get 20. That's pretty self-explanatory. The second thing is that we're printing the type of integer example. Here, the type of our integer example is integer, and that's shortened to int. That's why you get class int. I hope that makes sense. Now I'm going to hit escape, and let's talk about floats. Now a float is essentially the opposite of an integer. A float is a number that includes a decimal. For example, 2.2 could be a float, or 2.5, or maybe 1.6, or anything. So I'm just going to go back to my code, and I'll comment out all of the integer stuff using Control \. Now I'm going to go down, and I'll say float example equals 2.3. And I'm also going to say print float example. And we get 2.3. Now let's go over some examples of when you would need to use a float. Maybe you want to calculate someone's weight. Your weight is not always going to be a whole number. It can be, but a lot of the time it's not. For example, your weight could be 150.2 pounds, or maybe 93.2 kilograms, or anything like that. That would be a good place to use a floating point number. Another example is if you're measuring something. Let's say you have a laptop and you want to measure how long it is. Well, you could use centimeters. You could say that your laptop is 25.3 centimeters long, or maybe 20.1 centimeters long, or anything like that. As long as it has a decimal, it's a floating point number. So you can also use operators on floats. You can say float example plus equals 2. And you get 4.3. This is because 2.3 plus 2 is 4.3. You could also say float example times equals 2. And you get 4.6. You get 4.6 because 2.3 times 2 is 4.6. So you can do all of the operators that you would be able to do on integers on floats. So I'm just going to delete this operator. And I'm going to say print type float example. Now again, just like when we were printing the type of the integer, we're printing the type of the float. So here we're calling the type function, and the type function will return the type of the variable. After we get the type of the variable, we just print it, and it displays the text to the screen. So I'm going to hit Control S to save it, and Control B to run it. And we get 2.3 and then class float. The reason we get 2.3 is because float example is 2.3 and we're printing float example. And the reason we get class float is because we're printing the type of float example, and the type of float example is a float. I hope that makes sense. Now I'm going to comment this out using Control \. And let's move on to strings. Now a string is like a word or a sentence or a character. It's anything that has characters in it. For example, you can make a string called lartex, as we did in the previous video. Or you can make a string called hello, or hello world, or Super Bowl, as we did last time too. You can make a string that has any series of characters in it. So I'm going to go back to my code, and I'm going to make a string. I'll call it string example, and I'll set it to the value of lartex. Now I'll say print string example, Control B to run, and we get lartex. Now you can also do operators on strings. For example, you can say string example plus equals maybe programming. Now if you print string example, we get lartex programming. We're essentially just adding programming to the end of lartex. You can also change this to technology, and you get lartex technology. You can change this to whatever you want. You can also say string example times equals 2. And what this is going to do is it's going to say lartex twice. So if we hit Control B to run, we get lartex lartex. That should be pretty intuitive. Now I'm just going to delete this operator. And once again, let's print out the type. So print type string example. Again, we're first getting the type of this string example, and then we're printing it to the screen. Let's hit Control B to run. And we get lartex, and then we get class str. So we get lartex because the value of string example is lartex, and we get class str because the type of our string example is a string, and string is just shortened to str in Python. So I'm just going to comment this out. And let's move on to Boolean variables. Now a Boolean variable, also known as a bool, is a variable that contains the value true or false. For example, you could make a variable called is_it_February, and you can set it to true because it is February. You can also make a Boolean called am_I_20. If you're 20, then that would be true, but if you're not, then that would be false. So let's go back to our code, and let's make a Boolean variable. I'll call it bool_example, and I'll set it to true. Now I'm going to say print bool example, and let's hit Control B to run. And we get true. And I'm going to say print type bool example. Let's run it again, and we get true, and then class bool. Again, we get true because the value of bool example is true, and we get class bool because the type of bool example is bool. So I'm just going to comment this out using Control \. And now we are going to cover typecasting. Now that may sound weird, but here's how it works. So let's say we have a string, and it's set to the value 9, right? Now this may be weird because 9 should be an integer, right? But let's say for this case we set it to a string for some reason. Let's say we want to change that string to an integer, because changing it to an integer makes more sense. How can we change the type of the variable? Well, that's where typecasting comes in. You can simply say that your string, which is set to 9, becomes an integer. This is done through the int function. So let's go back to our code and test this out. So I'm going to say casting example is equal to, and then I'm going to make a string and then set it to 9. Now if we print casting example and we also print the type of casting example, then we get 9 and then we get class string. Now what we can say is casting example is equal to int casting example. What we're doing now is we're making a new casting example and we're setting it to the value of the old casting example passed through the integer function. The integer function simply gives us our variable as an integer. So if we run this now, we will get 9 again, and now we get class int. This is because we converted to an integer. Before it was a string, but now it's an integer. Now this would not work for a string that is supposed to be a string. For example, if we made a string called test and we try to convert it to an integer, it would not work. This is because there is no way that a string called test, which is supposed to be a string, can be an integer. But if it can be an integer, let's say if it's like 789, which is a number, then we get no problems. I hope this makes sense. So I'm just going to comment this code out using Control \, and I think this is where I'll end the video. I really hope you learned something about variables in Python, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then I suggest you to like the video, but if you didn't, then you should dislike the video and tell me what I did wrong. I always want to improve. I hope you're interested in tech, because we will be covering a lot of tech on this channel. This has been Lartech, signing out.